Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Hey, What Next listeners, it's Mary Harris. Before we get to today's episode, I have a favor to ask. This relationship feels slightly one-sided. Just me talking to you all the time. We want to change that. We have a listener survey we want you to fill out. It's going to really help us do the show better. And we'll hear from you. What you want, what you need, what you love, what you hate. All of that stuff. You can find the survey in our show notes for all the latest episodes, or you can visit slate.com/whatnextsurvey. Okay, on to the show. If there is one campaign promise that I'm pretty sure Donald Trump wants to deliver on, it is mass deportation. My evidence for this is simple. I watched a whole lot of Trump talking over the last few months. Listen to enough of Trump's speeches and you'll get the idea. Immigrants aren't great. They could kill you, and we got to do something about it. A couple days back, the president-elect started outlining how he was going to get something done in a very Trumpian way. When an activist on Truth Social wrote that the new administration planned to declare a national emergency to rev up mass deportation, Trump responded with an eager, all caps, "True." But it's hard to glean much from what is essentially a retweet. Even the words mass deportation seem vague. Deportation of whom?
I mean, I think it's intentionally broad.
Molly O'Toole covered immigration at the LA Times for years. I asked her to try to fill in the blanks with me.
I think that we have some more details now, but these are also sort of, these are really trial balloons. And this is sort of the playbook that we saw in Trump administration 1.0.
How mass do you think the deportations are going to be?
I think that what we're going to see is in the first few days, in the first few weeks of the Trump administration, is sort of this shock and awe, for lack of a better term. I mean, Stephen Miller himself has called it a blitz. You're going to try and sort of overwhelm the system with these broad actions. For example, I can imagine, sort of widespread workplace raids that would probably happen in primarily Democratic areas.
Molly says blue states are a good target because they have a way of spreading panic. After all, Democrats are the ones who will really freak out if there's an ICE raid down the street. She remembers this from the last time around, getting a call to rush into work because the administration was about to crack down. In the end, that wasn't exactly how things played out. Big raids got downsized. A lawsuit would slow the administration's roll. This time, Donald Trump's actions may be less constrained. But Molly says it's worth remembering there was never much constraining Trump's politics.
So I think that this is part of the playbook, is to get people really spun up, really concerned. I mean, the fear is part of the point. In the rhetoric and in the mind of Trump and his associates, all immigrants essentially are quote unquote bad. All immigrants are illegal.
Why do you say that? Because I feel like they would disagree. They would say, look, we just want the right kinds.
Right. I mean, they play these rhetorical games in a way that I find is really quite fascinating.
I was trying to get a sense of how someone like you might prepare for whatever is about to happen next when it comes to immigration. And I feel like I understood it a little bit more when I started grasping just how contradictory the information out there is. Like Donald Trump, for instance, has said he plans to remove between 15 and 20 million undocumented immigrants from this country. Are there 20 million undocumented immigrants in this country?
No. The estimates were between 11 and 12 million undocumented immigrants in the country. And then that actually sort of had ticked down. So to closer to 10 10 million undocumented immigrants in the country as the best estimate. But one of the main drivers of migration to the U.S. southern border, which is the focus of the obsession, has been people who are seeking asylum, especially over the past 4 years. These are not undocumented immigrants.
If we can't even agree on, like, what people were talking about when we're talking about some kind of deportation effort, how do we even start to understand what's about to happen?
I mean, I think that's part of the, intentional confusion.
Today on the show, trying to see the threat of mass deportations clearly. Will they happen? And if so, how? I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
Whether you're listening to ICYMI at double speed or regular speed, you'd probably love to know how you can get more cash back on your credit card. Either way, we'll slow things down a bit so you don't miss anything. Discover automatically doubles all the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
This show is brought to you by Discover. Have you heard about Doublenomics? It's okay if you haven't. It's extremely niche and practiced by Discover. Here's an example. Discover automatically doubles the cash back earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back into $300. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/credit card. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of how the Trump administration could upend immigration in this country, because there's actually a lot of information out there on the record from people who are going to be working within the White House, primarily from Stephen Miller, Deputy Chief of Staff, and Tom Homan, who's this Trump border czar. And I guess I want to focus on Homan just because he gave an interview to 60 Minutes. He spoke at the RNC. When he was at the RNC, people were waving mass deportation now signs. And, he had this line.
You better start packing now.
But then when he was on TV last month, he wasn't quite rolling back that idea, but he was like,
Well, let me tell you what's not going to be first. It's not going to be a mass sweep of neighborhoods. It's not going to be building concentration camps. I've read it all. It's ridiculous.
So what is your take here? Are we mass deporting people or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's telling that so far they seem to have been a lot of the sort of policies that they have suggested. In all of that, a lot of their focus is actually on recent arrivals and the people arriving at the border. I think it's sort of an explicit acknowledgement that they realistically cannot, and it is much more difficult, ethically, morally, yes, legally, yes, but logistically even, to go after people who are among the undocumented population, who are in the interior of the country and have been here for quite some time.
That's interesting you say that because, J.D. Vance has said.
I think it's certainly reasonable to deport around 1 million people per year.
That sounds like it would require a lot of organization, but it also doesn't seem like it's a number that's come out of nowhere.
I mean, it's easy for them to say, right? But all you have to do is look at the Trump administration 1.0. They had control of the Republican Party, held control of Congress and the White House, and they declared a national emergency and took $15 billion from the Pentagon of all places, and still couldn't achieve the resources that they wanted in order to achieve their goals. The Trump administration removed far fewer people than the Biden administration did. And in terms of Homan sort of going back and forth on who those resources will be focused on, it's just going to be people with, serious criminal records. They removed far fewer people, but the proportion of those people who were removed without criminal records was far higher. So J.D. Vance can talk about, we can easily remove 1 million people a year. And you talk to DHS and they'll say, we don't have enough manpower to do that. Absolutely no way.
That said, though, Stephen Miller told the New York Times that declaring a national emergency as Trump has indicated he wants to do, it could be used to redirect funds to build vast holding facilities that would function as staging centers for immigrants as their cases progressed and they were potentially flown out of the country. So it does seem like there is thinking about what could happen now and how to do things a little bit differently. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is fair. And I think that the U.S. military, if they're good at anything, they're good at logistics. You could build these large holding facilities in Texas relatively quickly. You're still talking about a dramatic increase in holding capacity that would have to be spun up. And they've tried to use this playbook before of declaring a national emergency and taking funds that Congress had appropriated for other areas to direct it toward their goals. Now, this is different, but I'm just saying, for an example, they declared the national emergency, and this was supposedly to, quote unquote, build the wall in 2019. I mean, it was the longest shutdown that the U.S. government had ever had. And in total, despite that being his signature campaign promise from the first time around, they could only add 50 miles. So let's say that they declare a national emergency. They can direct all of this funding, dramatically expanding the detention holding capacity of the United States beyond what ICE has or beyond, which is longer term detention. They still have to process people. Who is going to process people? That still takes a long time.
So you're going to need a lot of space. You'll need to add a lot of people to enforce the rules. And then there's the fact that some countries probably won't take migrants back.
We're not talking about people who can be easily removed. And so they're often held for quite a long time because they might be coming from a place like China. And U.S.-China relationship isn't exactly at its best right now. They might be coming up from a place like Venezuela, in which there isn't a diplomatic relationship and people can't be removed. Are all of these other countries going to agree to that? I mean, this isn't just about what U.S. policy can achieve.
Tom Homan did note when he talked to 60 Minutes that the U.S. has over 1.5 million convicted criminal unauthorized migrants with final orders of removal, including thousands of gang members by his estimation. To me, I think a lot of Americans hear that and think, well, okay, maybe someone like that should be removed from the country. But I do wonder how the federal government would go about finding them and what their criminal records actually are.
I don't know where he's getting that statistic. When we look at ICE's statistics about people in immigration detention, immigrants in the country who have criminal records, when you dig into those criminal records, it is most often for nonviolent offenses. Like the vast majority of those criminal records have to do with the very act of crossing the border illegally, or things like, drunk driving, traffic tickets, that sort of thing. I think that there is a tendency to cherry pick some of those statistics to try and make this tie in the American mind between immigration and danger.
One thing, though, that I think we should talk about is temporary protected status, because that is something that has skyrocketed during Joe Biden's presidency, because it's for people who are fleeing chaos and violence, like people coming from Venezuela where the government's in tatters, people coming from Haiti with the notorious gang problem. Donald Trump has said he wants to revoke temporary protected status for migrants. Can he do that?
They will try. They will do it, and they'll wait for the courts to block them. And we have very different courts in place, even below the level of the Supreme Court, than there were in 2016. But TPS absolutely is an immediate target. Part of it is that TPS has been essentially used as a way to get around the fact that there has been no comprehensive immigration reform in 40 years.
Yeah, the Biden administration basically put a bunch of Band-Aids on the immigration system in various places.
The Republicans have done the same thing. So there's a lot of railing against things like temporary protected status because it's intended to be temporary and is essentially just continues to be renewed almost into perpetuity. There's been very few examples in which TPS has actually been ended for a particular population. Both parties, Republican and Democrat, have used this to sort of kick the can down the road. And then you also have to look at the fact that, Yeah, we live in a different world. I mean, there's mass displacement on levels that we haven't seen in modern human history. And asylum, in part, is supposed to be one of the avenues to address this. So the increase in TPS under the Biden administration, I think, to some extent, is a reflection of the world that we live in. And it's partially a reflection of the Biden administration as well, essentially trying to evade the obligations, international and domestic, of U.S. law of giving people access to asylum. Because if you route people into these other pathways, whether TPS or parole or some of these other programs that the Biden administration in particular, initiated, those are not pathways that could eventually lead to U.S. citizenship, which the asylum system is. And there's no numerical, limit on asylum. If you arrive at the U.S.-Mexico border, as soon as you touch a toe to U.S. soil, then that access to asylum is triggered. Now, there's no guarantee that you will get it.
But you have years and years to plead your case.
Yeah, I mean, the average pending time for a decision in an immigration court is more than 2 years. And the backlog has ballooned under every administration. And now I think it's at 2 million. Under U.S. law, they're still obligated to give access to asylum. Now, you don't see either the Biden administration or the Trump administration talking about changing asylum law. If you don't like the law, change the law. But as it is, this is legal immigration.
Practically, I've heard some previous immigration enforcement appointees say that to them it's pretty clear how a mass deportation could go down and who it would impact first. Like there are certain groups of people, Haitians, Guatemalans, where their countries accept deportation flights from the U.S. in a way that, say, Venezuela doesn't. Maybe people with temporary protected status when it comes to Haitians, people who are internal to the country and flying them out. Is that fair? Is that right to you, what I'm saying?
Yes, I do think that there are certain populations of people, particularly those people where their countries have agreed to take them back, or that are particularly susceptible to coercive policies from the U.S. that would force them to agree to take their people back. Central American countries are absolutely the case with that, and populations that have temporary protected status. So I think TPS is vulnerable. Recent arrivals and people who Mexico has agreed to take back, I think those people will be sort of the first that the Trump administration looks at, along with workplace raids. I think these will be the groups of people that they will target.
After the break, what's Trump learned from his first term? And how could that make his second time around more effective? This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Shifting a little money here, a little there, hoping it all works out? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can be a better budgeter and potentially lower your insurance bill too. You tell Progressive what you want to pay for car insurance. They'll help you find options within your budget. Try it today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Tackle the NFL action on FanDuel. Get started with $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. 21 plus and present in Virginia. First online real money wager only. $5 first deposit required. Bonus issued as non-withdrawable bonus bets which expire 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
The truth is, the United States has been detaining and deporting people en masse throughout the 20th century and beyond. During World War II, thousands of Japanese Americans were forced to live in internment camps because of racist suspicions of allegiance to an overseas enemy. During the Eisenhower administration, over 1 million Mexican temporary workers got targeted for sudden removal under a program that became known by the derogatory name Operation Wetback. As a result of Eisenhower's deportations, many U.S. citizens got expelled by mistake, But that has not stopped Donald Trump from praising the effort anyway. So I asked Molly, couldn't this happen again?
That is the concern, of course, with these promises of mass deportation from the Trump administration and from folks that have not showed a hesitation to either end run or outright violate the law or not sort of pay attention to the fine details of the law, such as removing U.S. citizens. I mean, under the Trump administration, there was a denaturalization initiative, and that's something else that they've talked about resurrecting. So obviously there's the concern in and of itself with some of these promises of mass deportation. And then, of course, there's the concern that, and they've been quite explicit about this, that these efforts directed at non-citizens could then be expanded or could absolutely sort of catch up in the dragnet of these policies, U.S. citizens, which is what happened under this operation in the 50s, which Donald Trump has expressed a lot of admiration for.
You know what I kind of worry about? I worry about these plans getting gummed up in some way. People inside and outside of the government might be pushing back on whatever Donald Trump wants to do in terms of mass deportation. Like if you're using military assets or National Guard assets, that gets into governors who may not want you doing things, people in defense who may be worried about national security. And then the Republican Party being able to blame their political opponents for any problems the country has. Like they can say like, hey, we tried to do all the things you wanted us to, but then these groups came for us and we just couldn't do it. So you need to give us more power so we can push forward and mass deport even more. Do you think about that?
You know, I'm an immigration reporter. I covered the Department of Homeland Security under the Trump administration. I covered the 2016 campaign. I covered all of that slew of executive actions that happened in January and February. You know, I covered that administration all the way through. I think it's sort of remarkable the degree of amnesia that somehow gets applied to the first Trump administration, in that they weren't able to achieve so many of the things that they promised. They were sort of essentially able to sort of frame that lack of fulfilling many of their campaign promises when it came to the wall or when it came to immigration enforcement. They were sort of trying to frame that sort of as someone else's fault, not because of ineptitude or sort of utter chaos and confusion and infighting. To the extent to which, you know, you see the election results where people seem quite ready to believe that they'll be able to achieve it this time. I don't think anyone should underestimate the ability of Trump and his officials to somehow successfully put the blame on someone else when they aren't able to achieve what they have promised.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that I think Trump and his administration was able to change was public opinion. Like I look at a Brookings poll from the fall that found 1/3 of Americans agree with one of Donald Trump's most chilling turns of phrase, that undocumented immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country. In some ways, I could see it as hopeful, what you're saying about like, oh, everything will be blocked. But I actually don't see it as hopeful because I don't think that actually gets at the root of the real problem here.
Well, right. I don't think everything will be blocked. I mean, like I said, I think that they will not be able to do what they promised, and they know that. I absolutely think they will be able to do quite a lot more than they did the first time around for some of the factors that we outlined. He's putting complete loyalists in place. None of these quote unquote adults in the room, although they didn't seem to have much success checking him either. Congress has rolled over even more than it had the first time. The courts look very different. And public opinion. I think that's true. I think that is where that has been Stephen Miller et al.'s true success. has been in completely shifting American public opinion when it comes to immigration, to appealing to the sort of basest instincts of fear.
And you can't block that in the courts.
Right. And that can't be blocked in the courts, right? Like we're talking about the American psyche. We're talking about the American mind. I think you don't have to look much further than the Biden administration and the language that was even employed or the policies that were promised by candidate Vice President Harris. And you never hear a proactive case for immigration, much less a case that could just be made because it is fact in that asylum is the overwhelming driver, and asylum is U.S. law.
Molly, I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Molly O'Toole is a journalist and the author of The Route, an upcoming book on migration. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. We are led by Alicia Montgomery. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. You can go track me down on Blue Sky if you'd like. Mary Harris is the way to reach me. Pretty simple. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon. Hey, it's Mary again. Thanks for sticking around to the end of this episode. Before I say goodbye for the day, quick reminder to take our listener survey that we're running this month. We want to make sure your voice is heard. Visit the show notes or slate.com/whatnextsurvey. It'll only take a few minutes, I promise. Totally painless. Thanks again. I'll see you next episode.